We can classify synaptic plasticity into short and long-term processes, depending on the timescales on which they act. Short-term synaptic plasticity acts on the timescale of milliseconds to minutes, while long-term plasticity can last from minutes to hours or even longer. Let's start by focusing on some short-term mechanisms of plasticity. First, there's short-term strengthening of synaptic connections, also known as synaptic enhancement. Short-term synaptic enhancement results from an increased probability of presynaptic neurons releasing neurotransmitter in response to presynaptic action potentials. How does this work? Because ultimately more neurotransmitter is being released, synapses will strengthen for a short time, which can be recorded as an increased excitatory postsynaptic potential. This process is called synaptic facilitation. Second, there's a short-term weakening of synaptic connections known as synaptic depression. Synaptic depression, sometimes referred to as synaptic fatigue, is usually attributed to the depletion of readily releasable neurotransmitter vesicles in the presynaptic neuron upon repeated firing. However, synaptic depression can also arise from postsynaptic processes and from feedback activation of presynaptic receptors. We'll sometimes also talk about short-term plasticity mechanisms like these in terms of adaptation of a neuronal circuit. In particular, there's an important pervasive idea in sensory neuroscience that it's much more important to signal changes in the environment as opposed to the steady state. For instance, the appearance of some new shape in the tall grass might signal the arrival of a predator, and that might be more important than signaling the unchanging presence of the tall grass. Adaptation mechanisms often operate on relatively short timescales, and they can help the brain be ready to process important new information without getting bogged down by things in the environment that aren't changing. It should be noted that adaptation can be driven by synaptic enhancement and depression, as just described, but they can also be driven by other mechanisms, for instance at the level of the sensory organ itself, or at the level of complex network dynamics.